Okay, well, I guess we'll get started here. So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining the 8th Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or FACOP, webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online Climate Change Adaptation Community of Practice, which is run by OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, and we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. After this very short introduction, we will have the main presentation, which will go for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then at the tail end of the webinar, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes for any questions that you might have for Catherine. Before we start though, I just want to mention that for those of you who dialed into the conference line, your lines have been automatically muted. So if you'd like to ask a question during the discussion period at the end of the webinar, all you will have to do is just dial *6 to unmute your line. And as well, we are recording the webinar, which I will send out to the registered participants sometime tomorrow, and we'll also post it to the FACOP website. And so also you'll notice that we're running the webinar using Adobe Connect. There's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. So if you have any difficult or technical difficulties or problems during the webinar, just use this chat box to type your message and I'll try to help you as best as I can. As well, for those of you who are not on the conference line with us and just listening through your computers, you can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for Catherine during the question and answer period, and then I can just read them out loud. So I know we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with what the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACOP, is. So quickly before we start, I just wanted to mention that the FACOP is actually a subsection of a larger website called the Climate Change Adaptation Community of Practice, or we just call it the COP. And the COP is an interactive online community that provides a space where researchers, experts, and practitioners can come together to communicate with others who are working in the field of climate change adaptation. And this larger COP is national in scope, and it currently hosts close to 500 members made up of provincial and territorial employees, individuals from other levels of government, academia, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector. So the FACOP is a sub-community located within this larger site. So it's basically a site within a site, and it's dedicated to those members who are working in the forestry field or who are interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada, and it provides a private space where members can share information and best practices on current activities in the area of climate change vulnerability and adaptation in Canada's forest sector. And it's free to join, so if there's anyone on the line today who's interested in learning more about the FACOP, please contact me for more information, and you can find my email address in the chat box on the left there. So with that being said, on the line today we have Dr. Catherine St. Marie, who has generously donated her time to present this webinar for us today on assisted tree migration and its potential role in adapting sustainable forest management to climate change. And this presentation will provide an overview of assisted tree migration, describe many of the potential opportunities and risks of this strategy, and outline current thinking on responsible implementation of assisted migration of tree species. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Catherine has a PhD in biology and forest ecology from the University of Quebec at Montreal. She is currently the Senior Science Advisor on Climate Change for the Canadian Forest Service and also coordinates Forest Change, which is the new national climate change adaptation program for the Canadian Forest Service. Catherine recently led the development of a theme issue of the Forest Chronicle on the subject of assisted migration and is involved in several national and international climate change science initiatives. So with that introduction, I will now turn things over to Catherine. And thanks again for being here today, Catherine. It's very much appreciated, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Annette, and thank you all for joining the webinar. First, I want to say that I don't do active research on assisted migration, but as Annette was saying, I had the privilege to lead and coordinate this synthesis on the subject of assisted migration in the last years. So this presentation is not the product of my individual work, but it is the result of the work of a fantastic team that I had the privilege to work with in the last year and that I'm proud to represent today. So we all know that climate change is already affecting our forests with impacts that are complex, multidimensional, and interacting. Several climate change impacts on forests are easier to detect than others, such as increases in the frequency and severity of disturbances, fires, insect outbreaks, drought. But there are other changes that are more subtle, such as changes in species distribution, increase in mortality rates, changes in growth and productivity, temperature changes, and phenological events. Given these impacts and the fact that Canada's forests mature over long periods of time, we're talking between 50 and 200 years, forest management planning must account for climate change. And this is the case for forest sector adaptation. If we don't take action or delay our action, it can lead to rising costs and irreversible results. In 2008, the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers recognized that climate change was actually challenging our ability to achieve sustainable forest management. The CCFM then identified climate change as one of the two national priorities, along with forest sector transformation. The CCFM document, A Vision for Canada's Forests 2008 and Beyond, actually stated that consideration of climate change and future climate variability is needed in all aspects of sustainable forest management. Following that call for action, a national climate change task force was established, and since then, it has developed a series of documents and tools to enable the forest sector to adapt to climate change. The first report that came out of this call for action was the report Vulnerability of Canada's Tree Species to Climate Change and Management Options for Adaptation, an overview for policymakers and practitioners. That report was led by Mark Johnston and is available on the CCFM website. In this report, assisted migration is listed as one of the many options for adapting forest management to climate change. Assisted migration is actually an adaptation option that is listed in all of the reports and journal paper discussing forest management adaptation strategy. Personally, I would even say that assisted migration is somewhat the poster child of forest management strategies for adaptation. Adapting forest management to climate change can be a fuzzy concept, but assisted migration is easily understandable, and implementing assisted migration is often seen as a concrete, empowering means to take action against climate change. So what is assisted migration? The definition we propose is the human-assisted movement of plants or animals to more climatically suitable habitats. Moving plants and animals is not a new practice. Humans have been moving plants and animals since the inception of agriculture. But what is different here is that assisted migration is a movement that is motivated by climate change. So we do have some indication that tree species are already responding to climate change by dispersing into more climatically suitable habitats. And research and climate projection indicate that some population will be unable to keep up with the rapid rate of environmental changes. Assisted migration appears therefore as a potential adaptation option to maintain the biodiversity, health, and productivity of Canada's forests under continued climate change. So this is a type of map that results from the work of Dan McKenney's team, an initiative called the Plant Hardiness Project that aims at mapping potential distribution of plant species under different climate change scenarios. These distribution maps and the high-resolution climate and climate change models that are being developed are available online, which allow forest planners and policymakers, both within and outside Canada, to graphically visualize potential species distribution. What this kind of tools show us is that there is a general northward, upward movement of tree species into formerly unsuitable habitat that is forecasted under almost all climate projection. And what this kind of tool also show us is that the rate of change in climatic niche is generally expected to be, in general, about one order of magnitude faster than the potential migration rate of 3 species. So most species are expected not to be able to follow their climatic niche in space. Looking at the scientific literature, this bibliometric analysis showed that the number of research publications that use the term assisted migration, assisted colonization, or managed relocation in their abstract or title has rapidly increased since 2007. The results from 2012 are incomplete, but given a similar number of publications for the remaining months, the final value for 2012 could be as much as 60 publications. We also notice an increase in tree and forestry-related publications over the last 2 or 3 years. So there's a huge increase in interest in the scientific community for this concept. When we look at these papers, we find out that there's a lot of different terms and definitions that are used to describe assisted migration, with subtle differences, but it does make a difference in the way that this concept can be understood and discussed. So it's often focusing on the purpose of rescuing species, preventing them from extinction due to climate change. What we also discovered is that there's a range of viewpoints. There are proponents and opponents of assisted migration, and often both sides feel very strongly about this concept. So with some very strong titles, such as assisted colonization is a techno-fix, or assisted colonization won't help rare species. So there's a pretty animated or hot debate in the scientific community about the concept of assisted migration. Here in Canada, in terms of implementation, assisted migration is already starting to be implemented in some jurisdiction across Canada. In British Columbia, the seed transfer zone has been extended to 100 to 200 upward in elevation for most species, and there is limited planting of western larch in selected location outside of its current range. In Alberta, seed transfer zone have also been extended 200 meters higher in elevation and 2 degrees of latitude northward for most species. Ontario is currently allowing seed source to seed zone matching to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And in Quebec, they're looking at incorporating risk of climate change maladaptation into seed transfer zones, seed transfer functions, and they're currently planting seed mixture composed of local and more southern seed sources in some regions. So assisted migration is emerging and is also quickly evolving. With lots of initiatives underway, decision support tools being developed, network being created, expanded, and even some changes into policies and regulations. So this is why we felt strongly that the state of the knowledge, state of the debate on assisted migration in the context of Canada's forestry was timely. So, and that was a direct response to the CCFM call for action for climate change adaptation for the forestry sector. So that initiative was initiated in May 2010, and our goal was to provide a neutral assessment of assisted migration in Canada to inform future decision-making on assisted migration as a forest management option to adapt to climate change. So it's not pro, it's not con, it's really about providing the best information and the state of the knowledge. Early in the process, we agreed that we needed to develop a range of products for a range of audiences. The first audience we identify was the community of forest managers because they are the ones who are often taking on-the-ground decisions. So for that audience, we agreed to develop a theme issue in the Forestry Chronicle, and we also presented a poster at the Canadian Institute of Forestry Conference in 2011. The second audience we wanted to target was the science community. So based on the findings and all the conversation we had during the development of the theme issue, we developed a spin-off peer-reviewed paper that was published in the last issue of Bioscience. The last audience are policymakers and the public. So this product is really a CCFM product, the summary for policymakers that is about to be released. And it's aiming to raise awareness on assisted migration, providing a clear definition and explaining the challenges of decision-making related to assisted migration for Canada's forests. So, as I was saying at the beginning, the theme issue of the Forestry Chronicle was really a team effort. So you see all these people who contributed as active authors to one or another of the 5 papers. You also have the name of the lead authors, but there's also a lot of people who contributed to our reflection and thinking and provided comments and inputs on draft papers. And just to name a few, these people include Brendan Larson, Mark Neff, Laura Gray, Mark Johnson, Kelvin Hirsch, David Price, Jason Edwards, Rigotier. So a huge collaborative effort, and we are very, we recognize the contribution of all of these people. So the goal of this multifaceted assessment of assisted migration was to provide, at this stage, a Canadian state of the science, state of the debate, and state of the practice on assisted migration. The theme issue was released in the November-December 2011 issue of the Forestry Chronicle. So this special issue included 5 papers, and I will briefly go over all of these 5 papers and do a quick summary because it's a lot of material, so I'll go very briefly over all of them and briefly summarize the findings of each of the papers. So the first one is an introduction to a multifaceted concept. It's really an introductory paper to the concept of assisted migration. And first of all, since the terminology, we felt that the terminology was not yet established around assisted migration, we proposed a series of definitions. So the overall definition of assisted migration we proposed is the human-assisted movement of plants or animals to more climatically suitable habitat. So it's a very broad, very inclusive definition. This paper also explained the range of practices that assisted migration can encompass. As I was saying, assisted migration can be applied to very different practices. For example, it's very different when we think about what is moved. Assisted migration can be applied to genetic population, but it can also be applied at a higher level to whole species assemblage. In terms of rationale, why it is moved, in general, the scientific literature concentrates on the motivation of conservation, saving species at risk. But assisted migration can also be implemented to maintain health or ecosystem resilience, and even to take advantage or a couple of degrees warmer to improve productivity. In terms of where it is moved, it can encompass the movement of genetic population within its current range, but it also can describe intercontinental movement. And on how it is moved, we can do it by seeds, by seedlings, and it can have different consequences. All of this whole broad range of potential practices that are all assisted migration practices, all have very different uncertainties and risks. Lastly, in that paper, in addition to the overall definition of assisted migration, we proposed the definition for 3 types of assisted migration that are very different in terms of the risk they can represent. So the first one is assisted population migration, which is the human-assisted movement of populations. We're talking about genotypes within a species established range in response to climate change, which is considered to have lower risk. The second type is assisted range expansion, which is the human-assisted movement of species to areas just outside their established range in response to climate change, facilitating or mimicking natural range expansion, which is moderate risk level. The last type is assisted long-distance migration. And this is the human-assisted movement of species to areas that are far outside their established range, beyond areas accessible via natural dispersal in response to climate change. And this is a type of assisted migration that is considered to have higher risk. Now for the second paper, this paper addresses the ecological implications for assisted migration in Canada's forests. It was led by Richard Winder, and involved the contribution of Elizabeth Nelson and Tanis Biermore. So what this paper covers is the level of science knowledge we have on different aspects of assisted migration decision making. If we look at the different type of information that we need to address assisted migration, we need to have information on the risk climate change posed to species, both in terms of the intrinsic vulnerability of the species and also its extrinsic vulnerability to external factors. We also have to have some kind of capacity to prioritize species based on their ecological importance, but also based on the importance they represent for human interest. And in term of ability to invoke assisted migration, we need information on how to actually do it. We need decision support tools. We need information both in terms of science, but also in terms of practices. Looking in details about the different risks that climate change poses to trees and the risk we can oppose them to the risk that assisted migration can pose. So what are the ecological potential consequences of climate change? Well, climate change can create maladaptation to new climates, and we can observe changes in growth and productivity. Climate change also create or induce shifts in species range with the potential impact on the potential effect of extirpation or arrival of invasive species. When migration or adaptation is not possible, extinction through climate change is predictable. Climate change can also cause modification of key ecological interactions or ecosystem properties. And it can also create change in ecosystem structure and disturbance, fire, insects. So these are the potential consequences of climate change, but if we decide to actually implement assisted migration, there are also risks that are associated with assisted migration. And the first one is the risk of failure. And some argue that it could be a diversification of effort to actually invest a lot of effort into assisted migration and not investing the same effort in just maintaining resilience of the existing system. Another risk is the lack of fitness to new habitat. So maladaptation of the moved species or genotype. When we often assisted migration choices will be based only on climatic niche, but we know that ecological niches are multidimensional. So we also need to think about other niche dimensions such as nutrient requirements or photoperiod. The other type of impact of risk of assisted migration is the impacts on the recipient ecosystem. So introducing new genotypes or new species can have the impact of intra or interspecific hybridization with a dilution of the local gene pool. We can also it also has the risk of species loss via interspecific competition if the introduced species become more invasive. So there's also a risk of creating invasive species with erosion of biodiversity, disruption of key ecological processes, introduction of pests and diseases. And there's also a risk of loss of resilience by the creation of artificial systems that are dependent on human intervention. The third type of risk is the potential impacts on the donor system, collecting seeds or seedlings from another system could have the impact of species loss via over-collecting propagals of at risk. So this paper also provides a decision framework, and I invite you to look in more details at the framework to help go through the decision-making process, starting with assessing species vulnerability and going through all these steps to actually take decision about the type of doing assisted migration or not, or the type of assisted migration to implement. And note that for each of these choices, monitoring species health and impacts of the introduced species on the new environment is mentioned as a key step. The third paper of the synthesis is focusing on this first step, which is to assess species vulnerability. It was led by Tanis Binmore and benefited from the contribution of Richard Winder. So this paper provides a detailed exploration of existing vulnerability assessment that could contribute to assisted migration decision making. So this is the list of vulnerability assessment tools that the paper describes in more detail. And I won't go in more detail. If you're interested, you can. I invite you to go to the paper, look at the paper. This fourth paper addresses the socio-ethical debate around assisted migration. I would say that this is the paper that took us a bit outside of our comfort zone. None of the authors are philosophers. We're all scientists. But in all of, and I would say that all viewpoints were represented around the table. Isabelle Aubin from Great Lakes Forestry Service led this very interesting venture. And I will cover the main findings on the next slide, but I think Isabelle has joined us. So if you have a question specifically for Isabelle at the end of the session, I will invite you to talk to her. We also have, I think, Greg O'Neill who's one of the Canadian leader on specialists on assisted migration. So and he was part of this team effort. So if you have questions for Greg, I'm sure he's going to be happy to answer. So the key goal of this debate paper was to outline several major perspectives that define the opposing views on assisted migration, and to actually shed some light on the ethical roots of that debate. And this debate can actually be summarized in the following sentences. Should we let nature find its way in the face of climate change, or should we override natural processes and intervene? And there's no right or wrong. The answer to this question is really based on values and beliefs. When we look at the literature, we often find that the debate is very polarized. But when we look closely and reflect on the subject of assisted migration, we realize that there are many different forms of assisted migration, and each of them involve unique risks and benefits, thus making the debate much more nuanced than often portrayed. Actually, the scientific debate on assisted migration focuses on ecological risks and benefits. However, numerous uncertainties reduce our capacity to quantitatively assess those risks and benefits. And very interestingly, one paradox of the assisted migration debate is that the same argument can be used to both support and oppose assisted migration. So both opponent and proponent are motivated by maintaining health, maintaining biodiversity, protecting nature. And much of the debate can be traced back to fundamental perspectives on nature. Those with a view of human as competent managers of nature tend to support assisted migration, and vice versa. So when looking in more details at the paradox of assisted migration, if we're implementing assisted migration to address maladaptation concerns of maladaptation of species, we will choose genotypes that are adapted to future climatic conditions. However, assisted migration could worsen the situation if climate predictions are not accurate, or if other unexpected variables become an important driver. If we're implementing assisted migration to protect species from extinction, we will choose species that are in the risk of extinction. But assisted migration could worsen the situation because to be successful, the species should have the potential of invading the recipient ecosystem, thus potentially extirpating local species via competition. If we implement assisted migration to maintain the resilience of ecosystem, we will look at introducing a species or genotype to maintain a given ecosystem property or service. But that could lead to the disruption of key ecological interaction and result in a reduced resilience in the future. So it's a pretty complex issue. And I think Muller and Ellman in their paper in 2008 really summarized very well the paradox of assisted migration in these words. Risks exist on all sides of the assisted migration debate. Risk of inaction, risk of unsuccessful action, and risk of being too successful, for example, by creating novel invasive species. The last paper was led by John Pedler and involved the contribution of Dan McKenney, Jean Beaulieu, Steve Colombo, Jason McLaughlin, and Greg O'Neill. This paper is really about the state of the practice, what tools, how to, what type of information do we have to actually implement assisted migration in the forestry context in Canada. So it goes over all the different steps, from selecting species, selecting migration distance, procuring seed, selecting planting sites, and also the planting and post-establishment consideration. And I will go very briefly, but you're very much invited to go over this very strong paper, which does provide a very thorough overview of what we have in hand, because we realize that we already have several existing tools to help any decision related to migration. And I will just give one example, and that's the work again of Dan McKenney's team. So this tool called Seedware is a tool to support decision on moving plant material across environmental gradients. So this tool allows users to investigate the similarity of current climate to projected future climate. So if you look at the panels at the bottom, the images, you'll have a picture of the current climate. And then you can actually visualize under a given scenario where this current climate will be in a given time frame. So the second panel will show you where the current climate will be in 2071, 2100. So where maybe the population that are living there will where their climatic niche will be in some 80 years. The third panel shows you where where your seed procurement could be for the current climate. So where the climate, where it's always hard to explain, where the climate of will be in is actually and will be in 100 years. The conclusion of John et al. Paper is that due to existing knowledge and established best practices, assisted migration is currently much more feasible for major commercial tree species than for rare species of conservation purpose concern. Assisted migration of commercial tree species usually involves seed movement within or slightly outside current range limits. So we're talking about assisted population migration, which may be deemed less risky than longer range movement of species into novel locations. We also find out that several provinces already begun to implement assisted migration for commercial tree species. But it also mentioned, and I think we need to be clear on that it's only one option for forest management adaptation. Additional means of promoting forest adaptation should continue to be explored. So in conclusion, this theme issue shows that assisted migration is still an emerging concept. And to facilitate discussion and moving forward on assisted migration, the focus should move towards a really clear definition of values, goals, and the underlying motivation for assisted migration. And there is a need for a place for discussion. So we need to put in place some forum for discussion among the different stakeholders that are involved in this kind of decision. And now the spin-off research article. So the following slides were developed by John Pedler from Great Lakes Forestry Center. And John also led the spin-off research paper that was published in the most recent issue of Bioscience. So one of the key findings of the Forestry Chronicle synthesis was that assisted migration could include a whole range of practices. But assisted migration as a forest management adaptation strategy in the forestry context in Canada was in many ways very different to what was portrayed in many papers. So this paper really shows and describes assisted migration in Canada's forestry context. So in opposition to species rescue assisted migration, forestry assisted migration is generally aimed at widespread and abundant tree species. It's not aimed at rare or species of conservation concern. And actually, all that is implemented, the proposed movement would occur either within or slightly beyond the current range limits. So we're not talking about long-distance migration. This type of assisted migration, the assisted population migration, so movement of genetic populations within the current range, reduces many of the risks typically associated with assisted migration. On the right-hand side, there are the results of the Muller and Ellman paper, 2008, that assessed the evasion risk from assisted migration. The top graph shows that actually there are very few invasive species that come from intracontinental movement. Most invasive species were moved across continents. And moreover, the second graph at the bottom showed that plants are probably the less invasive of all the taxon. And I would even say that trees are probably the lower risk one given their long life cycle. A colleague of mine would say that we're actually pretty good at controlling trees. But forestry assisted migration is not without risk. So there are risks that assisted migration could promote climatically resilient population at the expense of existing genetic diversity. There are also risks that assisted migration could result in the outbreeding depression. There are risks that error could be made when selecting population for assisted migration. And there are also risks of disease transmission. However, these risks are already undertaken as part of standard forest management procedures. Many resources are already in place to help carry out forestry assisted migration, which is not necessarily the case for rare species of conservation concern. Provenance data is available for some species in some areas and provide information on how well population will grow under different climatic conditions. Also, seed procurement, processing, storage, and seedling initiation systems are already in place for most major forest species. Finally, the requirement for successful plantation establishment have been worked out for these commercial species. Forestry assisted migration is not expected to add much to existing regeneration costs, though increased monitoring may be required at migrated plantation. There are potentially significant economic benefits to forestry assisted migration if projected growth loss can be mitigated. Actually, there's a study led by Greg O'Neill showed that suggests that assisted migration could help to mitigate growth loss of up to 10 to 40% under climate change. There are also potentially significant conservation benefits if forestry assisted migration helps to maintain healthy and resilient forest ecosystems. Note that this line of reasoning could lead to the conclusion that all forested land need to be cut and climate-proofed again using assisted migration-based reforestation approach. However, it's important to remember that assisted migration creates plantation, which differ from natural forests in many ways. And there are still significant uncertainties around future climate, species adaptation, capacity, community dynamics. So in summary for the bioscience paper, forestry assisted migration is a relatively low risk, low cost climate change adaptation option that is feasible and could impact millions of hectares annually. But it's not a magic bullet. Plantations are not the same as natural stands, and there are still significant uncertainties associated with the different steps of decision making. So assisted migration in the forestry context should be viewed as one of many approaches within the portfolio of forest management adaptation strategies. And as a conclusion, these are some suggestions for future consideration for forestry assisted migration in Canada. There's a number of initiatives that could be undertaken to help build capacity for forestry assisted migration. So one of them is to develop an extensive and widely accessible warehouse of provenance trials data. That has already started in the US. Another step would be to develop a gap analysis to identify species and locations requiring new provenance trials. Third potential step would be to assess the risk that climate change poses to the current seed supply system. And another step, and these are not exclusive, but it's to better understand adaptation potential of tree species and epigenetics. And I would like to mention that last week the CFS put online a new website, not a website, but an additional page on assisted migration. So I would invite you to come and see this new resource. So thanks a lot for listening, and special thanks to Elizabeth Nelson for all her help and support on this work, the great assisted migration synthesis team, and the Canadian Council of Forest Minister Climate Change Task for Technical Analysis. That's a lot of people. I won't name them all. I know they recognize themselves. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Catherine. Good stuff. Great presentation. So we have about 10 minutes left, or around that amount of time for a discussion period. So I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. So if you're on the line with us, just hit *6 to unmute your line and you can ask your question. If you're listening in through the Adobe program, you can use the chat box there to type any questions that you might have. So yeah, if there's anybody that would like to start us off or have a question, maybe on the conference call line, just jump in. Anyone at all, don't be shy. Okay, well, I have a question that might get things started here. So, Catherine, are you aware of any assisted migration that's aimed at rescuing rare species that are of conservation concern in Canada?
Not that I know of, and if anybody know of such on the line, they're welcome to answer. However, one of the best known example of assisted migration is the movement of Thoria taxifolia, which is an endangered yew tree that is currently found only in northern Florida, and that tree was actually moved by a citizen group called the Thoria Guardians. So it's a citizen group. They didn't do any consultation, and they have moved seeds and seedlings of this species hundreds of kilometers north of the current range to location as far as North Carolina and Ohio.
This is Henry Lickers.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, there are many examples of tree movement in Canada and the United States. Butternut, black walnut, catalpa, pawpaw, tulip tree were all moved by Native people up to 10,000 years ago, and they have been moved north. The natural extent of butternut in Canada, I don't know where they get this natural extent range from, were moved by Aboriginal people because they liked the nuts. And so they would plant them wherever they could, and then if they survived, that was great. If they didn't, they were no longer put there. I find the papers are quite useful to me, but I still think you've got to go back to the Canadian Forestry criteria and indicators, and where is the Aboriginal content in here? We have a long history of this working with these species, and I've got 2 pages of comments on this that I think we could add the traditional knowledge of Native people. It would be very helpful to the discussion, but I don't see it anywhere.
Well, that would be great to add that information. And what I mentioned at the beginning is what is different about assisted migration is that, like, we recognize that plants and animals have been moved by humans for centuries or millennia. But in the context of assisted migration, it's purposely to address the climate change issue. So
well, let me interrupt. 1300s to the 1800s are the mini ice age that occurred in Canada and North America. Those people, we were on the move at that time. Mm-hmm. People who are the Haudenosaunee have been here in the St. Lawrence River Valley since about 10,000 years ago, when the end of the Wisconsin Ice Age. So within our stories and talking about these species, we know about these movements. Butternut and black walnut particularly were found in North and South Carolina around those times in the past. Mm-hmm. And they were gradually moved north by the people until now. In the Canadian Tree Book, they talk about the natural range of butternut and black walnut. But I'm not so sure those are natural ranges as they were extended north by our people.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because what is actually the natural or distribution of trees, right?
If you take 100 or 1,000 years to move trees, you can genetically modify them in order to make sure that they survive in the area by continuously trying them over. So I don't want to occupy all of the conversation, but what I would say to you is I think it's very important that even under the Canadian Forest criteria and indicators talk about involving Aboriginal people as a useful component to this. I think this type of discussion is useful. EPA and Environment Canada just hosted a climate change meeting in Akwesasne here in Cornwall, which brought together Native people from all over Canada and the United States to talk about some of these issues. So I think as Forestry Canada, I also work with the Eastern Ontario Model Forest and the Ontario Professional Foresters Association. I think we need to reach out to more of our people in order to see what kind of information we can add to it.
I totally agree, sir.
Okay, thanks, Henry. Does anyone have any further questions, maybe a comment to add to that? Anyone at all? Oh. Okay, well, if there aren't any more questions, I guess we'll wrap up here. So thanks everyone, obviously, for joining the FACOP webinar today. We hope you enjoyed it, and a very big thank you goes out to you, Catherine, for your time and effort for an excellent presentation. And just a reminder that a recording of the webinar will be available tomorrow, and I'll send it out to everyone who RSVP'd, and we'll also post it to the FACOP site. So thanks again, everyone, and have a great week.